Algae, how I love you, my dear old algae. I filter all night and day to clean up your bay. All right, this is Crassostrea virginica, also known as the Atlantic oyster, the eastern oyster, the Chesapeake oyster. Basically, if you have an oyster in the western hemisphere, or I shouldn't say, when you get an oyster off the east side of the United States all the way down to South America, it's one of these bad boys. These guys are the mainstay of life here in the Chesapeake Bay. They come up as spat, which means basically a female who releases millions of eggs at one time. They will be free floating for a period of about 3 to 4 days. At that point they become sticky and they grab onto the first hard thing they can find. Quite often the hard thing they find is another existing oyster, but it can be mussels, it can be wood, it can be metal, it can be a lot of different things. Once they start growing, they grow exponentially, very, very quickly, until they get to a larger size. And then of course, like everything else, their growth rate slows down precipitously. It takes about 3 to 4 years for an oyster in the wild to get to market size. This is roughly market size here, 3 inches or so. They get much larger given more time. They can get 2 or 3 times the size given long enough, but most of them don't make it that long. There are essentially 2 different kinds of pots used by people, floats, used by people to raise oysters. The older one is called the Taylor float. That's this one here on my right side. As you can see, it's open face. They do make Taylor floats which have tops on them. All right, these are the Taylor floats, the most common. They're kind of going out of style now. But these guys float on the surface. The PCV, of course, access the buoyancy with the air inside of it. They're either open-faced or with a cage like this on top for keeping out the crabs and flotsam if possible. But these are very easy to work with as far as getting out the culling and so forth in the middle and checking and sizing and so forth. However, when it comes time to actually move the oysters around and stop them from sticking to each other, the flip float is a better choice in that particular case. The most common size for these guys is about 4 feet long and about 2 feet wide. The ones you're looking at here are a little bit smaller. These are, I think, 2 feet by 2 feet. And behind you, you can see they have the 4 feet size. So the Taylor float is supported by the PCV pipe all around. It gives it buoyancy. You have a hard mesh on the inside which holds the weight of the oysters. And then, of course, you just have the oysters sitting freely inside. This is a better float if you need to come through and cull it, which you do have to do periodically because oysters do not always live. They die a lot, so you have to come through and cull it. This is the one you want to use for that because it's much easier to reach the oysters. You just reach in and grab them. But when it comes time to actually agitate them, move them around so they don't stick to each other, this is not a particularly good design for that. For that reason, they came up with another one, this one right here called the flip float. The flip float is named, obviously, because it flips over very easily. It has. All right, what we're looking at here is called a flip float. These are the most popular nowadays for gardeners like myself, and they're often used in commercial as well. These have the, as you can see with the flip float, it has a buoyancy on both sides of the PCV pipe and an enclosed cage, which simply opens up by undoing this, and now you have access to your oysters. These are very, very popular now because you can flip them very easily, unlike the Taylor floats, and flipping is important. You have to keep the oysters from sticking to each other. They grow into each other, and that's when you flip them over, it kind of breaks them apart. It also makes sure that you have good water flow for all of them. You don't have any that are stuck in the middle all the time and getting very reduced water flow as a result of being surrounded by its sibling, so to speak. So this is a very popular one. Again, the flip float is the name of it, and we'll see more about these later. The biggest drawback to the flip float versus the Taylor float is that in the Taylor float they're open-faced, which means whenever you want to do any kind of culling, you just reach into it and do it. These guys, you cannot really do that. You have to take it out of the water. You have to put it up on land, pop it open, spill out the oysters that are in there, then cull, and then put them all back in there, and then put it back in the water. So that is much more time consuming and difficult to do with one of these than it is with the older traditional Taylor float. Side, it opens on one end as so, but whenever you need to agitate it, all you got to do is you flip it. Voila! You do that, breaks them apart, the ones that are growing together. It helps to make sure none of them are in dead zones where they're not getting a lot of water because they're completely covered by other oysters. It stops all that, but when it comes time to cull them, you essentially have to take the cage out of the water, pop open the side, dump all the oysters out, go through them manually, and then put them back in the cage. So obviously if you're doing commercial production where you're doing 10,000 or more a day, which the farmers do, I'm not a farmer, I'm a gardener, this would not be a very time-effective way of culling them. But when it comes time to flip them every week or two, which the commercial guys are doing, this is obviously a much better choice than the Taylor float, which is, as the name will tell you, floating away.
What's this float? with the top on it.
This is a tailor float also with a top on it. It's the same float, it's the tailor with a top. All this one does is simply has, when it was made, he made it with a top on it. So you can flip this part up and you have access to it on the inside.
Does this allow you to flip like the other one?
No, it does not. It is not a flip float. It will not flip the way the other ones do. Now with this little one here, this is a small mesh. When you have babies, spat, you get them in a very small size. They're too small to fit in one of these guys. They would fall through or grow into these openings, which of course would be bad. So you put them in these mesh bags. This is actually the number 2 size. The number 1 size is about half the holes are half the size, and they grow up in here until they're big enough to take them out and put them into a full-size float without worrying about them falling through or being small enough to get wedged in there and start growing across. Because when they grow into it, they will literally grow around this mesh, which is obviously very, very bad for.
Are those big enough to move now?
These are big enough to move for the most part. When you move them, you take them out, you size them because they do grow at different rates. Oysters, some grow 2 or 3 times faster than others. So you take them out, the biggest ones you put them into where you want to, where they'll be fine. The small ones might not be too small still. You put them back in here and let them grow up some more. But yeah, these guys are ready to come out and be sized out. What we have here is a bottom cage. These are most commonly used by commercial operations. These cages this is actually a double decker. There's 2 separate cages, one on top of the other. But if you notice, the bottom one has these legs on it. These legs run the length of it. They're about 6 inches deep. And what these do is when you put the cage down on the bottom, it keeps it off of the actual bottom, which allows better water flow for the oysters and stops them getting sunk in the mud, because they can also they can actually asphyxiate if they get stuck in the mud too deeply. So this is their method of doing it. They use boats to come by. They wrap a strap around it or rope around it, and they have cranes on the boat, small cranes on the back of the boats, and they are able to lift it up using the crane. When this thing was filled with oysters, and the oysters are good size, it would probably weigh several hundred pounds and be pretty much impossible for a person to pick up without the use of a machine. Alright, more oysters that came from a similar batch. These guys you see were in the larger mesh. They were a little bit older than the first batch. First batch is going in a little tiny mesh like this, and you move them to the bigger mesh because the more water flow you have, the better. Water flow is key to these guys growing. They're filter feeders. They need to have as much water flow as possible. So this is a bigger bag of some older ones. You see these are on average considerably larger than the ones you found in the other batch. But again, there are ones that don't grow very quickly. There are small ones in here too. So what we're going to do is we're going to separate them, put the big ones together, put them into a float, probably a flip float, and we're going to take the smaller ones and put them back in the bag, let them grow up some more, and then go from there. Say that, huh?
How old are the ones in the first one, and how old are the ones in the second one approximately?
These are about 4 or 5 months old. These are probably 6 months old. I got them about a month and a half apart, as I recall. This is put back together. Now we're going to put it back in a tailor float where it'll lay on its side as such in the float. Some people will hang these vertically off of their dock. You can just put a rope through it and hang from your dock, but that means they're all stuck together on the bottom, which isn't ideal. You want to get maximum water flow. The reason I put them in a tailor float on their side like this is that obviously you get better water flow. Everything spreads out more, it's less compressed, and everything's going to be able to filter feed and do its job and grow properly. Here. You got a little, that's like a seal.
Don't need your nose in the camera.
Alright, that's it. That's all for the little ones. Just, you see them growing like that. Here you see a little mussel has managed to attach to our oyster. So that little mussel got on there. We'll take him off. It doesn't do any harm to have him on there. We just take him off, let him grow on his own. Throw him into our marsh grass, and he'll grow up big and strong. And at some point, a lot of oysters are going to be grabbing onto him when they're spat and starting clumps, which we'll show you a little bit later. Here, let's close it up as so, and bang, you're ready to go. Big old crab in here.
There's a lot of oysters in there.
here we're going to do a demonstration. This happens a lot where one oyster will grow to another oyster. This is naturally occurring. You can use an oyster knife for this. I personally just use a flathead screwdriver.
Put your fingers in the way.
Pop this guy off. We'll keep him. This is an empty dead shell. We do not keep that. You're going to do that a lot. That's really a big part of this is separating the live ones from the dead ones. And unfortunately, oysters do die. It happens. Can't do a whole lot about it. There's a couple natural diseases which are devastating. It normally affects them as they get older, not when they're young, but as they get older. Dermo is the most famous of it.
How do you know where to insert this screwdriver?
Just practice, honestly. Just kind of try to find the seam. That's the best
seam between the two oysters?
Yeah, the seam where they see these guys. Well, you got a couple muscles here, so I take the muscles off. As I was saying, mussels are an excellent substrate for oyster spat to attach themselves to. And all up and down the coastline here, we have marsh grass. The mussels will kind of dig their way into the sand right at the base of the marsh grass, and then you'll find clumps of oysters. In this case, only one oyster on each, but normally you'll find clumps, 5, 6, 10, 20 baby oysters attached to a single mussel shell. I think there's something about the serrated shell on a mussel that is perfect for catching spat. So these guys, that's why I always try to save the mussels whenever possible, put them back in the marsh grass so they can attract and become home to more oysters for them. Also, the mussel shells are kind of thin and weak, so when you try to separate them from an oyster, a good chance the shell is going to break on the mussel because they're not nearly as strong as these guys are. All right, whenever you're separating oysters, I prefer personally use a flathead screwdriver. You can use an oyster knife. They both work just as fine. You want to find the seam between where the 2 or 3 or more that were joined together. You put the blade end into it. You kind of dig it in a little bit. You don't want to push through the shell. And then do a little twist. And just by that little twist motion is enough to break them apart. So now you have 2 separate oysters. Allows them to grow fully. They don't impede each other's growth or choke each other out by taking all the resources for other ones. So here you see these 2 are attached. You still got a baby mussel there. Just kind of wedge in there. There you go, a little pop and bang, pop loose. Sometimes it's very easy, sometimes it's difficult. Just do the best you can and try to not lose any whenever possible.
Okay, go.
All right, so while I was culling my oysters, I found this little guy hiding out in his last meal. Oops, he just jumped for it. Hiding out in his last meal, but that was a beautiful example of a oyster crab doing its business. And the oyster crab is not the blue crab. The blue crab is a completely different species. We have the blue crabs here, which are all throughout the bay and a food source for everyone. We have the oyster crabs, which is that little guy you saw there. We also have what's called fiddler crabs, which live in our tidal marsh about 30 feet behind where the camera woman is standing. And there are thousands of those little guys that walk on mud. There's so many of them you can hear them walking, and these are thousands of little tiny crabs, maybe an ounce at the most, walking on mud, and you can hear them. That's how many there are of them.
So the oyster crabs also do the same thing as the blue crab? They get in there and...
Well, no, the oyster crabs, yeah, the oyster crabs get in there and eat them, I think, after they're dead. I don't think they can actually penetrate the shell. I think the blue crabs can penetrate the shell, not the oyster crabs.
Check out these 2 snails, the pattern snails these are making.
Oh, yeah. That's what we have millions of over here.
They're chugging through the water.
They're trying to get to dry land because they don't breathe water.
Snail's pace.
Oh. All right, as I mentioned before, if you don't agitate the oyster pods properly, the oysters will grow right through the mesh. As you can see right here, I didn't touch this one for about a month in preparation for doing this video. I did not intend it to be quite this bad, but as you can see, this guy grew right through the mesh and 3/4 of an inch beyond it. So obviously this is about the last thing you ever want to have happen, because it's not good for the oyster, because you're going to pull them out of there. It's not good for the mesh, because they will over time destroy it. And these are, $100 a piece or more for these oyster floats, so you don't want to be messing with them like that. But I just want to show you that example of this is why you got to agitate properly on a regular basis. The flip pots are 100 times easier to agitate than these guys, but these guys are much easier to cull. Agitate. I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. All right, so here we have 2 different oysters. This one grew up on the piling that is right next to me, this guy right here actually, and he and a bunch of others grew up on that piling. If you look at how thick it is, you see it's very, very thin. It follows the contour of the piling, obviously. All of these guys do, they're little tiny ones. But this is not ideal for oysters you're going to eat. The reason is you want to have a deep well. This is called a deep well. The bottom part of the oyster is called the well. When you agitate the oysters in floating pots, and to a lesser degree in nature when they roam free, as they tumble, it makes it grow a much deeper, thicker shell down here that holds more water and it ultimately holds more oyster inside of it. So the meat inside one of these guys is going to be much less than one of these, even if they're the same size, so to speak, as far as the width and the length of it is. When you get a thin one, this one unfortunately broke open as I was removing it. You see that's a tiny little oyster in there. That wouldn't be good. Even when it gets bigger, it's not going to be much more meat on it because it's such a thin shell that these things are made out of. So it doesn't really give you a good product at the end. Everybody wants to get the nice deep wells like this. This is naturally occurring when you agitate them, when they roll around in either a tailor float or a flip float, or even the cages that sit on the bottom to a lesser degree. But this is what you're after.